Randomized Clinical Trials Ethical Aspects by Professor Dr. Khalid Saeed Khan. I'll introduce Professor Khalid briefly. He's a distinguished investigator at University of Granada, Spain. With a H index of greater than 70, has published over 400 peer-reviewed papers and supervised 25 higher degree theses. Professor Khalid has also contributed to many trials and meta-analysis and has run 48 primary research trials. Professor Khalid Khan was ranked first among the top rated experts in research in the world during the years 2011 to 2021 using an objective analysis of the PubMed database by expert scale. Before we move on to the webinar, we'll share briefly with you one of Comstech's new flagship projects, which is the Comstech Technology and Innovation Portal. I'll just share my screen. So Comstech has launched its new flagship project called the Comstech Technology and Innovation Portal. It is basically a digital platform provided for the OIC world where they can showcase and exhibit their existing and emerging technologies. The portal calls for exhibition in the various fields such as information and communication technologies, natural biosciences, engineering technologies, energy, medical and health services, and so forth. So this portal basically caters to two type of individuals. One, those are looking for different type of products. That could be an investor, that could be for collaboration, that could be for any reason. And the second individual would be those that want to promote and showcase their own technologies to the OIC world. They can simply log into the portal, join with a email address, and they would get verified in 24 to 48 hours. And then they can go on to post their products. Here, for those searching for products, they can look up technology services of their liking, depending on their area of interest, depending on the location they're looking for, which country, or whether they're looking for a product in the prototype or commercial stage. So this portal can be accessed through technologyportal.comstech.org, which is also available on our website, comstech.org. With that, I would now like to invite His Excellency Professor Dr. Mohammad Iqbal Chaudhry, Coordinator General Comstech, for his welcome address.
Thank you very much, Haseeb, for introducing Comstech's new initiative. This webinar is continuation of many activities which we are trying to conduct in a very important area of clinical trials. Never before the importance of clinical trials come forward, as we have seen in case of COVID-19 pandemic. And we have seen that countries with no prior experience of conducting any clinical trials are now conducting clinical trials. And there was a sense of urgency of all kinds of medicines, biologicals, vaccines, and these clinical trials are now widely conducted. So if you look into the clinical trial database, you would find many countries with literally no existence 2 years before now conducting regular clinical trials, and Pakistan is one of them. And that we are in the process of conducting many clinical trials, both for biologicals as well as for synthetic drugs. Now, in the process, there are many people who came into this field, which is certainly an extremely important field, but are not properly trained in this extremely specialized area, which requires lots of insight, both clinical, ethical, statistical, and different aspect of it. Truly transdisciplinary field in which expertise of different kinds are required. As a result, there is a situation in which either the countries would become hub of lots of clinical trials if they are able to do things in a right way, or they would lose credibility because they're not able to do things properly. And that is the reason why we thought it's extremely important for us to continue to work towards that, and who can be a better speaker than our own very dear friend, Professor Dr. Khalid Saeed, who is also a distinguished comstech scholar. Dr. Khalid Saeed, more than anyone else, has not only supervised clinical trials, but also critically reviewed very large number of clinical trials conducted, literally involving millions of people. So he knows pros and cons, merits and demerits, down and upsides of clinical trials. And that is the part of an ongoing program in which we are trying to benefit from tremendous experience and insight, wealth of knowledge, and futuristic view of Professor Dr. Khalid Saeed Khan. With this, I would like to welcome you, sir, for your presentation. I'm extremely grateful for sparing time. You're a very busy man, but for a greater mission, you're always available, and that is the strength of your personality. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm in fact privileged to have the opportunity to speak at the Comstech Forum. If it is permitted, I believe I can move on to present my slides along with my talk. Might colleagues confirm that they are able to see my slide?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, thank you very much. So,
yeah.
Thank you. So, I'm going to talk about ethical issues in clinical trials. But at the outset, I would like to say that this is not just about ethics committee approval for a trial. In fact, alongside ethical issues exist these two terms, transparency and integrity, which I place here as subtitles. And these three things together make for ethical clinical trials. And I hope to explain all of this in detail in the next hour or so. I am normally based in Granada, at the University of Granada in Spain, but today I am delivering this webinar from Madrid at Ramon y Cajal Hospital. It happens to be one of those locations where Nobel laureate position exists. And I am here because we are discussing issues concerning statistical integrity with the statistics team at the University of Madrid. Our idea is early next year, in collaboration with Comstech, to hold a proper consensus event that will generate guidelines for integrity in clinical trials. We'll talk more about that in the coming minutes over the next hour. So normally when we begin to think about this topic of ethics and integrity, we look to the history. And we normally focus on history over a long time horizon, where we talk about thalidomide disaster, or we talk about syphilis experiments in the United States of America. But actually, this is not just an old problem, it is a current problem. So here we note an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine last year from a top university in the USA. And from the publication date, you will note that it was published on 8th of May 2020. It did not take long, and within a month, a notice was issued about expressing some concern about this piece of work. And then this article was in due course retracted. So the point I'm trying to make is that the issue of integrity and ethics is an active issue for consideration today in the COVID era. In total, over 100 papers concerning COVID have been retracted. So it's not an isolated problem that happens in 1 or 2 cases. It's happening across the board. And this type of problem is being described in the literature as a question of survival in the medical misinformation mess. So I hope with today's presentation, you will gain insight into this issue and how to navigate the waters of research with respect to clinical trials, while there are red flags being waved concerning integrity. Here is a study from this year, published in Science, which states that in Holland, Dutch scientists admit to engaging in questionable research practices. And that this is not an uncommon event. So I welcome you to the next heading called Scientific Misconduct. So what I want to highlight is that if any ethical or integrity issue arises, it can move from being a questionable practice into the area of scientific misconduct, which in the case of a published article can lead to retraction. And amongst the various definitions for scientific misconduct that exist, I have my own, which is that we do the right thing as researchers when nobody is watching. So if we can do the right thing as researchers when nobody is watching, a definition I have inherited from a colleague who is active in this research area, then I think we can avoid scientific misconduct or allegation of scientific misconduct. So with respect to the whole journey of a clinical trial, it starts with a clinical problem. For example, how to treat the early diagnosed cases of COVID-19. And this question can turn into a randomized controlled trial, which following development of its protocol can, with ethics approval, lead to recruitment of several hundreds of patients, and then following analysis of their data, lead to publication. Following publication, there are various other steps required for implementation and impact. But today, I would like to limit to 3 areas concerning ethics and research planning, the conduct of research itself, and the process of publication. So I would focus on ethical issues, transparency and integrity with respect to these 3 aspects in the journey of clinical trials. My presentation today will include the definition of a clinical trial, what is integrity, why is clinical trial important for society, and then the 3 aspects with respect to ethics, conduct of research, and reporting before I provide a summary. So this is the definition of a clinical trial used by many different bodies. The fundamental issue here is that human participants receive interventions to evaluate the effect of the intervention on health outcomes. And the interventions can be a range of things: coronavirus vaccine, would be one of those interventions. Wearing a mask could be one of those interventions. Maintaining social distancing, another intervention. So all of these things, not just injections and operations, are interventions. And with respect to drug regulatory approval, these 4 different phases of trials are described. My presentation will largely focus on phase 3 trials, which includes several hundreds of patients and are often conducted in multiple centers, and nowadays across many different countries and across continents. I'll go to define these in more detail in a moment. But the bottom line with respect to formulating questions that can be evaluated in a clinical trial tend to look like this. Will the new intervention be effective? Question mark. Convert this into a scientific hypothesis. We need to think about defining who will be the participants, the intervention comparators, and the outcomes. And in this case, where I show with a cartoon, the participants are being invited to consider 2 options: to receive a standard treatment, which will be the comparison, and the health outcomes will be compared between the standard treatment and the new alternative. And with this information, we can proceed to design a study where participants can be randomized to be allocated to a standard treatment or a new treatment, and then they can be followed up for health outcomes. In performing research concerning interventions, here is a list of what are pointers to bad science, or in other words, to science that does not generate facts. It generates fake news. In this, I highlight 3 points to you of importance: use of control groups, blinding, and appropriately large sample sizes. And using appropriate methods with randomization, this type of research will rank at the highest level of evidence, and it will rank higher than non-randomized studies with control groups, and specifically much higher than those studies that do not have control groups. So using this information as a benchmark for trustworthiness of science that can be used to inform health policy, randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials will rank at the highest level of evidence. This is why it's important that these trials should be conducted in an ethical fashion, and the integrity with which they are reported will determine the extent to which they can be useful for informing practice and policy. So this is what a trial looks like. A sample of participants is, in the case of randomized trial, randomly allocated to receive intervention and control. People are followed up for measurement of outcomes. For example, a COVID diagnosed case with mild symptoms following treatment, can they avoid admission to intensive care unit? This type of a study would be a typical example of the studies that have been carried out in the last couple of years. From these studies, we can generate data where outcome can be classified as being present or absent for the new intervention and the control group. And note that along the way, patients or data can be lost. This introduces an integrity issue inside a study. In this case, the effect size that we calculate from the data reported may not necessarily be trustworthy. Therefore, in order to conduct an ethically approved study in a robust fashion, the responsibility lies with the investigators that they minimize the patient data loss to a minimum, to zero if possible. And we're going to cover issues of this kind as we proceed in today's presentation. I'd like to give an overview of the relationship between different types of science and clinical trials. So there is lab science, and then there is science generated by collecting data from individual patients and groups of patients. And the idea is that we move from lab to health impact. We move from evaluation of how vaccine can be prepared to actual use of vaccine to prevent transmission of disease and to reduce severity of disease in the community. This is called research translation. It goes through various phases. So clinical efficacy studies move on to clinical effectiveness studies. And they then move on to evidence synthesis and then to implementation and guidelines. And we have observed this over the last 2 years, that vaccine studies started with a few volunteers, then thousands of people across several countries randomized to vaccine versus placebo, then information presented to drug regulatory authorities. With their approval, vaccine is now being given with the idea to be implemented as an intervention across the world. Looking at clinical trials with respect to the terminology used in regulatory approval, phase 3 studies fall in the clinical effectiveness terminology that I have presented a moment ago. And phase 4 is what is currently ongoing with respect to monitoring of what happens to people who are receiving vaccination. So the multi-center large studies are the ones on which I will focus on in today's presentation. These studies are put together in systematic reviews. The evidence is graded, and then this type of evaluation is used both in drug regulatory approval and guideline making at health ministry and country level. I highlight that systematic reviews are conducted alongside clinical trials, and systematic reviews is a process that gives us information, including information about clinical trial integrity. So once we combine information concerning integrity with effectiveness, we are able to then decide whether this information from clinical trial is trustworthy and usable for evidence synthesis and guideline making. As you will see in a few moments, this is a very important step because systematic review can capture concerns about ethics and integrity of clinical trial and may in fact discard evidence previously generated and even published and may not include it in systematic reviews. And this leads to research wastage. So one of the key issues concerning clinical trial integrity and systematic reviews is that we should undertake research, the primary research with patients in a manner that it is usable for systematic reviews so that there is no research wastage, so that research can in fact guide policy and improve outcomes. We don't want hundreds of COVID studies to be retracted. We want all of them to be done in a manner that they can be used for practice. And why is this important? This is important because we take action based on our beliefs, and our beliefs may be underpinned by correct knowledge, which is scientifically based, or they may be based on incorrect knowledge, which is scientifically proven to be wrong. But it's our belief system that allows us to take action, and this action can be well-informed or misinformed. And the idea is that scientific knowledge, particularly through clinical trials that rank highest in the hierarchy of evidence, that it underpins the belief system that generates information with which we take action with respect to health policy and practice. So we now turn to integrity with respect to whether we can distinguish between what is factual information and what is fake information. Now, please remember, in our history, we have often believed things that had no scientific basis, and eventually we have had to discard those ideas. I take here two examples from history. On your screen on the right-hand side, the diagram is associated with the germs present on human hand. And in the COVID era, we are aware of hand hygiene as a key factor. We'll turn to this in a moment. But taking a general lesson from the history concerning Galileo and the movements of Earth as a planet around the sun, this idea was first put forward in the 1600s, and it took over 350 years for various religious organizations to accept it as a scientific fact. So please beware that it can take time for science to be changed to be brought into the belief system. Now take the history of Semmelweis. At his time, the idea was that infection is that fever after childbirth is the result of bad air. But he had observed that mortality was higher in the midwifery units not run by doctors, compared to midwifery units run by midwives. So he put forward a simple idea: hand hygiene with lime juice mixed in water. And with this, he observed that mortality in the units run by doctors came down to the same level as those in the midwifery units. This was because doctors in training were moving between dissection rooms where they were working with dead bodies to learn anatomy, and then without washing their hands, were giving assistance during childbirth. And by a simple intervention like hand washing, this mortality could be brought down. However, his thesis was not accepted at the time because the knowledge system that existed disregarded the fact or did not believe that such a simple thing like hand washing could reduce mortality. In fact, he was incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital where he spent the rest of his life. But today, his advice is recommended by virtually every country health ministry, hospital, doctor, and healthcare provider. And his statue exists at the entrance of the World Health Organization building in Geneva, where I had the privilege to take this image that I show in the top right-hand side of this slide. So we return back to the simple idea of comparing two groups created by randomization, one receiving a new intervention, the other receiving standard care, following them up for health outcomes. collecting their data in a manner that the study during its conduct has integrity, analyzing the data and calculating the effect size. This effect size, if the study is conducted with ethics approval, appropriate oversight during the course of the study with proper analysis, then the effect size calculated will be true for the sample of people who entered the study. If the sample is representative of the population, then the result will also be true for the eligible population. Remember, the majority of the people who have now received the vaccination were not, in fact, part of the clinical trials. So the idea from clinical trial is to discover the truth that can be widely and generally applied across the population. And that is why ethics and integrity are highly important in clinical trial. If we cannot trust the clinical trials, we cannot really go ahead and recommend interventions. At this stage, I'd like to give you a little background to my own career history. I completed medical school. I started medical school in 1983 in Karachi, in Pakistan. I then worked for some time in Kenya, following which I returned to complete my training as a gynecologist in Pakistan. And during this time, I became interested in research, acquired research qualifications in Canada. I then moved to the UK, where I worked in various hospitals and universities, moving south every few years, spending last 10 years until 2020 at University of London, at Queen Mary University of London, from where I moved to University of Granada. In that year, I had the privilege of visiting Pakistan to give a lecture to a series of workshops and lectures concerning the importance of research and how to get published. And at that time, I emphasized the need for engagement in research. And all of this was published and presented to various people. And in January 2020, here we see a news article from an English daily in Pakistan. This was before COVID was formally announced to have spread in the country. In fact, I did not know myself the importance of this message for my country of birth at the time when I was delivering this message in January 2020. I was surprised to receive an invitation to join the coronavirus research committee in Pakistan, but I was grateful that I was able to use the knowledge and experience I had gained concerning trials in this role. And I'll turn to this in a moment. I'll just take you first through my experience as a researcher. My first research article was published in 1990. We're talking about over 20 or 30 years ago. And my first systematic review was published in 1995, 25 years ago. And during my 25 years in the UK, I had the privilege to be able to edit various journals, write a book about systematic reviews, lead several randomized clinical trials, as well as serve as head of organizations that give oversight to research in, like the two listed here, Women's Hospital and the Barts Trust in London. So I gained experience all the way from designing research to giving oversight to research, to conducting research myself, to analyzing and writing up research, and then to receiving papers as editor, evaluating papers as editor, in my roles as research director and as editor, receiving complaints about research misconduct and investigating them. So in this way, I happen to have the relevant experience with which I am able to confidently present to you the various elements that are necessary for ethical and honest research practice with respect to clinical trials. This top part of this slide shows the 37 countries where I had the privilege of presenting information concerning importance of research and its integrity. Here, I highlight with the orange line on your screen the numbers of patients who I have been able to evaluate as part of my research. And without their contribution, my own research publications would not have been possible. So the responsibility as a researcher I have is not just to my employer, who is normally a university or a hospital, but in fact, it's the responsibility to the people who participate either as volunteers or patients in studies, and they voluntarily, under consent and ethical approval, donate their data for use by researchers like me. In order to fulfill this responsibility, I, as a researcher, must ensure that I do everything possible within my means to minimize errors, to conduct the research to the highest standard possible. And it is with this spirit that we should engage with patients, inviting them to take part in research. Here I highlight the need for this integrity throughout the research process. Often people think about research integrity as a responsibility for journal editors. I urge you to think about this issue not just as a matter relevant for research articles published or retracted, but as a matter of importance throughout the process, starting from the formulation of research question. And to highlight why this is important, here I refer to a paper published known as Hong Kong Principles of Fostering Research Integrity. And here you can see that it moves all the way from study formulation up ultimately to dissemination. So with this emphasis on the importance of the scientist's responsibility to patient and public that take part in research, let's look at the interaction between science and society. So a health practitioner or doctor or a researcher's responsibility is to resolve uncertainty about the effects of treatments. This, to me, automatically implies engagement in research. And I have myself the privilege of taking part as chief investigator or co-investigator in trials where over 10,000 people have taken part. In order to fulfill my responsibility, these are the three key ethics, regulatory, and consent principles. I must respect the people who take part in research. They have their own autonomy, and I should not violate their autonomy. They should voluntarily take part in research. The research I design should have the possibility to create benefit for society, not just for me as a researcher by populating my CV with 2 additional lines of my publications. And it should fulfill the principle of justice. And with this background, I, with ethics approval, can invite patients to take part in my studies. And here we see an example of an invitation to take part in Pakistan, run from the center in Karachi, which is a comstech center of excellence, where I had the privilege to visit during the conduct of the study earlier this year. And here we see an example of why this engagement in research is important. Following the Second World War, breast cancer mortality was rising decade after decade, despite the fact that there was economic, educational, and other forms of social development in society. During this time, patients were being recruited into studies, and by the mid-80s, nearly 30,000 women have been randomized in over 60 randomized controlled trials. It's only after this critical mass of studies and patients taking part that, in fact, a difference was made, a dent was made in the breast cancer mortality, and it started to fall down. So research is important for improving the outcomes for future patients. The question also arises, does it help current patients? For example, earlier this year and last year, patients who participated in COVID vaccine trials, did they accrue any benefits? At the time of the trials, we did not know whether the vaccines were effective or not. We were inviting them to volunteer to engage in this research in order that information can be generated to benefit other people after these research projects are completed. This matter of whether people benefit from taking part in studies has been subject of various evaluations, including one in my own team published some years ago. But here is one from before the publication from my own team, which shows that wherever outcomes are compared for patients who were inside trials compared to those with the same condition who were outside trials, there tended to be a benefit for taking part. The same was repeated in the work in our department, where it appeared on average that nearly 25% benefit is accrued by being part of a study than by not being part of a study. Of course, these comparisons are non-randomized, but they point towards the possibility of there being a benefit from receiving care as part of a trial, in part because in the course of a trial, the interventions being provided are given after ethics approval, review of protocol, under the watchful eye of a safety and monitoring committee by people additionally employed to undertake research, thereby increasing the exposure to safety inside the context of the care being provided inside a trial. With this background, let's just examine what happened with respect to coronavirus vaccination trials in Pakistan. In March 2020, last year, along with other members of Comstech, I happened to be invited to this Science and Technology Committee concerning COVID. Soon afterwards, the Drug Regulatory Authority gave approval for studies to be conducted in Pakistan. So here is a news item concerning this. In August last year, and in January this year, we're talking about within 9 months of the committee being formed, that the trials were nearing completion and the process of registration for use of the vaccine in Pakistan was going ahead. During this time period, by engagement in research, thousands of people were able to receive vaccination as part of being research studies undertaken within Pakistan. It's important that this knowledge through the trials was created in a manner that it was trustworthy and it could persuade the drug regulatory authority for the license to be provided for the vaccinations to be given widely. And this allows for the knowledge creation process to move forward for implementation in practice. Here you note I am highlighting once again that the knowledge creation process, the clinical trial, should have integrity. In summary, ethical healthcare requires reduction of uncertainty. It requires taking part in research, and it requires that opportunities to participate in research are available to people in the process of healthcare delivery. And without this, science cannot move forward. And for science to move forward to help society, it should happen in the context of ethics approval, conduct of the research with oversight, and publication with its own publication ethics. And this is what I'm going to move on to in the next part. So with respect to reminding you about the journey of moving from clinical trial through its ethics approval, its conduct, its analysis and publication, these are the three elements we are talking about. And first, I'm going to talk about the ethics and approval process. Ahead of this is the question formulation and the study design process. So typically, the study design is part of the protocol writing. The protocol is normally put together with a patient information sheet and a consent document in order for presentation and evaluation by an ethics committee. If approval is granted, we then can move on to obtaining approvals by the participating centers, including in, for example, the case of coronavirus vaccination trials, approvals by various regulatory bodies, as well as government agencies. So when a protocol arrives at the committee, research ethics committee, it's evaluated by committee members. It may be returned, and then this cycle of revisions can run over various rounds until approval is finally granted. Please note that I highlight this process of revisions because if a research project is submitted with some flaw, with some lack of priority, with some design issue that undermines or reduces the validity of the results that can be generated from such a study, then this study to begin with does not have an ethical role to be taken forward. So ethics committee approval is, in my opinion, not just about whether the consent can be obtained in a manner that is appropriate, but whether the study itself is scientifically sound in order for it to be taken forward, to be put forward to people for consideration. In this regard now, we can ask the question, what type of people should be ethics committee members? They shouldn't just be ethicists and representatives of the public and various other safeguarding interest groups with respect to patients. The committee should also include people who have expertise in design of clinical trials and analysis of clinical trial, conduct of clinical trials, because without their input, how can a committee fully assess whether a clinical trial proposed is in fact suitable for taking forward to actually conduct it and ultimately publish it? In this regard, the background section of any clinical trial protocol is highly important. It is not just a matter of scientific indulgence. We weren't inventing coronavirus vaccine just because it's interesting for scientists who know something about viruses and messenger RNA. We were developing these vaccines because the disease was prevalent and growing. It had an important effect on life quality. It had important economic consequences, and it was a priority for people. It's with this background that researchers were able to create protocols where they were able to show that no such vaccines exist. And then they were able to demonstrate that there was compliance with these ethical principles of respect for people, beneficence, and justice in order to be able to move forward in an ethics committee for approval. So with this background, I highlight to you that at the moment, the way ethics committee structure exists in various countries, there is quite a lot of heterogeneity. And this heterogeneity is not necessarily a reflection of variation in standards. It's a reflection of variation in how certain topics may have particular ethical concerns in particular societies, but not in others. I here give you an example of the importance of considering this variation. I ask you a question to consider. In a clinical trial, can an ethics committee waive the need for individual informed consent? I believe most of you will think that an ethics committee cannot really give waiver from individual consent. But I present to you an example of a study where I was a co-investigator, where we were introducing a new intervention recommended by the relevant health authorities, and we wanted to evaluate its effectiveness as part of its introduction in practice. In this case, routine data collected from people could be used to evaluate effectiveness. And we pleaded to the ethics committee with our explanation that the routinely collected data is suitable for evaluation of effectiveness. And the process of obtaining informed consent additionally for use of this data for randomized trial would be cumbersome and may compromise the integrity of the conduct of the trial. And in this case, could we have permission to waive individual consent? And on presentation of this case, we were glad to hear that the committee awarded such an approval, and subsequently this paper is published in the British Medical Journal. In another example, we asked a committee whether they would permit us to make a sham incision in a surgical intervention, in a controlled surgical intervention, because the outcome was self-reported by patients. And if they had knowledge of whether they received surgical intervention or they received standard surgical procedure, might influence their responses which assess the outcome of the intervention. And might we have permission to have a sham incision, an additional incision that would otherwise not be required in the control group? In this case, we were glad to note that the committee gave us approval, and with consent of patients, we were able to invite them to take part in a study where half the people randomized to the controlled surgical intervention were given a sham incision. And subsequently, the protocol, as you can see, was published in the journal listed here. And ultimately, the trial was published too, which I will show you results of in a moment. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors requires that ethics committee approval is obtained and confirmed at the time of presentation to a journal. It also requires that the trial should be prospectively registered. By this, I mean that the trial is made publicly available in its design before patients are recruited. So an essential step in addition to ethics approval is prospective registration of the trial. In addition, as shown in the previous slide, nobody stops you from publishing your protocol as an article in its own right. There are various journals that will welcome evaluation of protocols. So trial registration and writing of protocol and publication, both of these are important parts of planning and launching a clinical trial. Trial registration is mandatory. Protocol publication at the present time is not mandatory, but in my opinion, it's not just an optional extra. I would encourage people taking forward their trials to develop their trial protocols and submitting to ethics committee in such a manner that soon after ethics approval, they can be submitted to a journal. In fact, there is no reason why, as ethics committee role develops in the coming years and decades, that ethics committee assessment and publication in journals should not be somehow linked together in order to maximize the transparency that is ultimately required at the time of publication. Here I refer to articles published in the Pakistani journals, which are highlighting the importance of clinical trial registry. I also highlight that until now, such a registry does not exist, and perhaps Comstech would take a leadership role in this area to come forward with this extremely important, essential first step in conducting randomized controlled trials. We now move to talking about conducting research. In this area, I ask you the following question to consider. You, as a clinical investigator, have recently received approval to conduct your trial. You have appointed a research nurse or various research nurses or doctors to help you run the study. How would you ensure that they have the relevant knowledge and skills necessary to obtain valid, informed consent for which you have been given ethics approval, for which you have registered your study prospectively, for which you have a protocol ready for submission to a journal? Well, this requires thinking about what an organization should do to help the clinical investigators deliver the studies with integrity. Good clinical practice courses, which will ensure compliance with the vetted protocol, which will help protect participants' rights and will meet regulatory requirements, are an essential element of research staff training. In fact, research integrity ideal cannot be achieved without investment in a continuing education program for all people involved in clinical trials. Once the trial commences, there should be a system of monitoring, audits, and inspections that helps give oversight to the study And the purpose of giving oversight is not just to identify fault and apportion blame, but it is also to assist in areas of difficulty, give suggestions of how data collection procedures can be improved, how follow-up can be improved. And I urge organizations, representative of organizations who are listening to my presentation, to think about involving patient representatives in these procedures and processes that they develop for giving oversight to trials. I ask you another question. If you are the director of a clinic or a hospital or a service where a trial is going on, and if you have received a complaint that patients have been recruited without consent, do you really have mechanisms in place in your organization to investigate such a complaint? Well, there should be such concern at work policies that permit for such investigations to be undertaken confidentially, protecting both the complainant and the investigator in order to protect the patients, in order to protect the study, in order to maximize the integrity of the ongoing study. And for this, various procedures and manuals exist, which these organizations can employ, adapt, and develop within their own setups. So informed consent, where patients or participants are being offered the opportunity to take part in a study where there will be more than one options available, selected randomly. This is the challenge. This needs to be presented to the ethics committee along with patient information sheet. Once it has been approved, then it needs to be presented to individual patient. Just because ethics committee has given approval does not automatically mean that patients can be entered. The patient has their own right and autonomy. They can reject the invitation or they can accept the invitation. It's possible that you have to invite 100 people in order to recruit and only 20 or 30. It does not matter that people are not taking part in study because if they are exercising their right to not be part of a study, then we as investigators have to respect this right. What is informed consent? It requires that information is provided, that it is understood, and that the permission given is voluntary. It goes in a cycle. The information can be given in a written form, which normally is the patient information sheet approved by the ethics committee. But it can also be accompanied video or a web page. And most importantly, the verbal explanation that accompanies these recorded materials. And that time is allowed for discussion. And that time is allowed for comprehension to develop, for questions to be asked and answered. And then ultimately, for voluntary consent to be provided. Need to be free of coercion and with undue influence. The people offering information with respect to the opportunity to take part need to act in a neutral fashion. The consent can be withdrawn at any time during the course of the study. If this happens, this needs to be written down in the written report of the article submitted and explained. Here you can see already in the written paper, on the one hand, you have the responsibility to minimize patient loss and data loss, as highlighted in earlier slides. But at the same time, if the participant decides to withdraw from the study for whatever reason, after initially agreeing to take part, then for them to be removed from the rest of the study, and this removal be reported as a patient loss. Any editor or journal or peer review system that evaluates such a paper will value the honesty and transparency with which the data loss is reported by the investigator. Here I highlight the great responsibility that lies on chief investigator. They have a sponsor or a funder with their with ethics approval, and following ethics approval, they set up a team, including a statistician and clinical investigators, who are going to take the study forward. In order to take the study forward, various meetings, training events, I emphasize this word, training events, because without training of staff taking part in the study, really it's difficult to know how one can ensure that various individual staff, often there are hundreds involved in a multi-center clinical trial, how they can ensure that study has integrity. In order to give oversight to this study, there need to be some kind of monitoring committee system. In some countries, these are called trial steering committees. In others, they are called data monitoring and safety committees. Whether chief investigators should be part of such oversight committees need to be discussed and agreed ahead of starting such a trial. It should be considered and presented as part of the protocol for ethics approval. For this committee to be able to evaluate ongoing progress in order to give unbiased oversight, it may need to receive confidential interim analysis. This analysis may not report its findings to the chief investigator, may only report its findings confidentially to the independent committee members. And I urge colleagues attending to think about the need for involving independent patient representatives and members of the public in this type of oversight. It is with this type of system whereby following ethical approval, following registration, following protocol submission to a journal for publication, following staff training, following continuous oversight, monitoring, inspection, and audit, following interim analysis, following reporting of what is going on to the ethics committee if required, following updates on the trial registration, should there be any changes required in light of observations made. It's only then that we are able to have a final data set that can be analyzed and findings put together in a publication. With this, I would like to move on to the process of publication. I'd like to highlight at the outset the journey of experience of clinical trialists, where after all their hard work, often years of effort, in the case of coronavirus vaccination, months of effort across several countries and centers, they submit papers which may be, after peer review, rejected, revised, and resubmitted until they are accepted. Now notice, at this time, the journal and publication system has the opportunity to raise concern about integrity. This can happen both during the course of the peer review, but it can also happen after publication. For example, the article I showed you from New England Journal of Medicine at the beginning of my presentation was retracted after publication soon as a result of concerns about integrity. Here I take you through the example of the trial concerning sham incision, where I gave you an example of ethics. It was published in the Journal of American Medical Association. The idea was conceived in 1996. Patient recruitment commenced 2 years later. It went into a multi-center phase. The 500 patient sample size was completed in 2006. After completion of follow-up, data were analyzed and then submitted for publication. And the results showed that the intervention was not effective. At the time of submission, the paper went through editorial assessment. In fact, in the first instance, it was rejected at the beginning. It was then just resubmitted to another journal, and then it went on for referee assessment, who then provided peer review comments, and then editorial decision was made that it was rejected, revised, and resubmitted. Ultimately, till one of the journals accepted it following revision. So you can see that many steps take place after completion of the study. But a lot of these steps have no hope of going back and changing the quality or standard of the data collection. The study integrity issues have all already taken place and can now no longer be changed. The only thing that can possibly be changed at this time is how you perform analysis on the data. Even this would be afterthought, because the data analysis plan should be part of the study development in order for it to have a priori validity. And the other thing that can change at the time of publication is the interpretation applied to the results obtained. And this could, in some instance, lead to a positive or a negative spin on the finding, depending on the interests of the journal, the referees, and the authors. This trial subsequently became part of a meta-analysis or systematic review, for which the protocol was also registered and published. Here you see the published protocol of the meta-analysis. Here are all the various trials on this topic. They were put together and published in an individual patient data meta-analysis. And the overall result of all the publications put together also showed no benefit of intervention. Following this, a further trial is published. Note, this trial is published when it is already known from a meta-analysis that this intervention is not effective. You can ask the question, was it ethical to proceed with this trial when it was already known that this intervention is not effective? You can also ask the question, can there be a randomized trial with a single author? These type of questions are addressed by one of the biggest organizations engaged in systematic reviews, and they have their own policy about dealing with concerns concerning fraud, misconduct, and questionable publication practices. These studies were important because in the end, they led to the guidance that the intervention should not be used. So I'll run you through the process of what is a journal. It has an owner that has a chief editor appointed and a team that uses principles set by various organizations, two of them represented here. And these principles applied in a strategy lead to assessment of papers submitted. And if not rejected, they are then sent to the publisher to be put together into what is called a journal. At the time of their assessment, a list of various errors can be identified. Some of them are put together as questionable practices. Others are grouped under scientific misconduct. I highlight to you that 3 of these items here, ethics approval, no informed consent, or data fabrication, are all elements of ethics and study conduct. I now highlight to you a systematic review of authors' instructions by journals. And you can note that even concerning a basic step such as ethics approval for studies, there isn't a 100% coverage of this topic amongst authors' instructions in journals. I beg you to consider the question, how can the responsibility be left for integrity and ethics at this late stage where the journal instructions for authors themselves lack in coverage of very important issues concerning research integrity? In the interest of time, I'll skip through journal types, except to highlight that there are, in this publication industry, publishers who are scrupulous, and researchers should avoid engagement into these journals. Others that are not scrupulous will employ these and other recommendations for their practices. And they will consider these writing guidelines. But again, I remind you that they ask you to write your methods in detail, so those details are need to be transparent in order for there to be integrity. You don't want to be making these kind of errors that have been highlighted in previous studies. What is the prevalence of errors? Here is a study which performed a meta-analysis of reported studies. And it shows that self-reported data fabrication, falsification, or alteration may be at around a 2% level. And the perception that other colleagues may have done this is at a higher level, around 15%. Notice that this is a low percentage, but of course it is a percentage that is of concern, and that is why we are having this webinar today. At the same time, allegations are increasing, as highlighted in one of these analyses from organizations that engage in the assessment of allegations. But note that not all allegations find research misconduct. This is leading to concern among scientists that they will be subject of allegations unfairly. If allegations are made following assessment, the journal can make an expression of concern. It can make that expression of concern initially, depending on the nature of allegation, and it can subsequently also retract articles. And you can see here that the reason for retraction, the most common and most serious, most dangerous in my view, is suspected fraud. And here is a guideline as to how a journal would investigate when allegations are made following publication. These allegations have been led by people who have invested a lot of effort in figuring out how published data can be used to evaluate integrity. And here is one of those publications which gives a long list of items that can be considered. And using these items, journal editors have said that they would consider seeking original data, ethics approval, and trial protocols from authors. In addition, instead of going to the journals where papers are published, it's open for people who make allegations to go to open platforms like PubPeer and report their concern or make those allegations in a public forum, like in this case, allegation made by Professor Thornton concerning the paper listed above. In order for these allegations to have validity, First, the people making allegations, in my opinion, should use tests that have been thoroughly developed, because just by looking at published data, how can you be sure that underlying data does not have validity? And second, the researchers who have undertaken the trial should have their data available to address these allegations made in an open and honest fashion coming forward, and sharing the data in an anonymized fashion. Here is a paper that highlights that the tests developed for making allegations don't always have their assumptions set out correctly. And here in a letter that I recently submitted and has been published, in fact, the author of the test who generated allegations, when these errors in the assumptions were identified, readily admitted in a blog that the results of the test do not identify fraud. Post-publication tests, in my opinion, need more validation before they are widely applied to make allegations. In the process of introducing integrity in research need to be constructive. And the blame game is, in my opinion, not constructive. The issue of transparency in the complainant itself has been a subject of various publications, where the request for transparency is not always considered to be with good intentions. Sometimes there is a conflict of interest amongst the people who are making the allegations themselves. And various integrity checklists have been proposed, including the one shown here, which help you to survive through the medical misinformation mess. The idea that scientists are using a kit in order to generate fraudulent science, well, in my experience, in the experience of the vast majority of people who have invested in this area, is that this is rare and uncommon. Professor McLeod states that there is plenty of error and imperfection and uninterpretable results amongst published studies, but not necessary that this is a result of intention to defraud others. In my opinion, it's better to educate in order to have better, more valid, more trustworthy research output. So with this, I bring my presentation to an end. I highlight that science needs to be designed in a sound way, taking a slide from one of my colleagues from Holland who has looked at the issue of integrity, not just with respect to data integrity, but with respect to integrity of the science itself. And then the issue of transparency at the time of reporting. So the whole journey from question formulation to application is important. And this process can be facilitated by involving patients. So I conclude by saying that science is for sake of society. We need to approach research integrity constructively. We need to nip the evil in the bud, for which education is the best tool. Research must have ethics and governance approval. Consent must respect the ethical principles. Publication should be transparent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Khalid, for that brilliant talk. What we'll do now is we'll take questions. So to all the participants, those that have questions, please write them down in the chat and I'll read them out for Professor Khalid to answer. We'll give it a couple of minutes and see if we get any questions.
While we are waiting for question, I'd just like to thank Dr. Noor Fatima, who in the chat acknowledged the conclusion I provided. So I appreciate your support, Dr. Noor.
Earlier, there was a question from Ms. Mahira about vaccinations. She asked, don't you think that vaccination is break of ethic norms?
So if the question is whether people should be forced in order to receive vaccination.
Yeah, it says it is violation of human rights and it should be at will.
That's the point I'm trying to address. First, I think I would say that I am not an ethicist. So any answer I provide is my personal opinion based on limited ethics knowledge. But I don't believe any treatment can be provided to people forcefully. Even, for example, a cancer patient can refuse to receive chemotherapy. So the principle of autonomy with respect to provision of treatment is an extremely important principle with respect to research and health practice ethics. I hope that addressed your comment.
There is another question by Ms. Hina. She says, can we publish a study design on clinicaltrials.gov if there is no such body in Pakistan?
Please, can the question be repeated? I did not follow that.
Sure,
so you're trying to ask if there is no trial registered in Pakistan?
Yeah.
It does not matter. You can submit your proposal in an international register. For example, the PROTECT trial that took place in Pakistan last year submitted its registration document to the clinicaltrials.gov. But clinicaltrials.gov is not the only register. There are other registers available. Dr. Inara also made a comment about the presentation. I appreciate your positive feedback. Thank you.
There's another one by Ms. Uzma. How can we combat ethical issues in data collection?
Okay, so the first important issue with respect to data collection is that there need to be consent from the people with whom data are obtained. And I presented various slides on the ethics principles, which I'm sure will be available via Comstech website subsequently if due to lack of time, I can't go over them in detail. But basically, data loss means that we cannot perform a proper statistical analysis. So on the one hand, we need to get permission, but at the same time, when we seek permission, we should highlight the importance of completing the study in order to obtain all the data necessary for there to be a valid study. Because if there isn't a valid study, the study really cannot help. And if it cannot help, it cannot really be ethical to do such a study. I also noticed some other comments in the chat.
There is one question here. What is your opinion on challenge trials? Would they have been useful in the early stages of pandemic?
So I don't understand exactly what is meant by challenge trials. Perhaps the questioner, Dr. Juanra, can explain what he means by challenge trials. And in the meantime, I can take another question. The next question
from Dr. Noor.
Dr. Noor's question is, please suggest strategies for the principal investigator and committee investigator in light of conflict of interest. Okay, committee invigilator, yes. So look, the monitoring committees, whether data monitoring committee, steering committee, or or whatever other name is used for these type of oversight bodies, they need to be independent. For example, if there is a trial being run at my university, the chair of the oversight committee should perhaps be from another university. So there is no internal conflict of interest. They should not be a co-author of mine in previous research. So we don't have this previous familiarity. They should have competence in clinical trials, of course. But these independent members, there need to be several of them, and each one express an independent opinion. This is how they can give oversight and advice and support to the principal investigator.
I think your question about challenge trials
is coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there is another comment which I would like to address, which is how validity improves society. So validity means, internal validity is a technical term used. Validity, internal validity means that the results found in a study are true for the sample of the people who took part. The term external validity means that the results that are true for the sample are beneficial and are correct and applicable for people who did not take part, who are outside the study. And the people who did not take part all would represent the wider society. So in that case, I hope I have explained in other words than the words I used before, how validity can improve the outcomes for society. I think another question from Dr. Lubna Kanwal is concerning temporary and long-term effects. Indeed, if I get the gist of the question right, the phase 4 trial, which I showed in some of the initial slides, is the manner in which the effects or undesirable effects not captured during the course of the effectiveness trials will need to be captured and on an ongoing basis after implementation of a clinical policy. So Dr. Kwandra has explained his point concerning challenge trials, stating that challenge trials are participants are exposed to harmful intervention. Well, you make a lot of assumptions here when you write these two first concepts. How can you know something is harmful without even evaluating it in the first place? The second is, any trial, whether what you call challenge trial or randomized rollout trial or feasibility trial or pilot trial or any other such prefix ahead of trial, would need to be approved by an ethics committee before it can be put forward for participants to take part. So whatever kind of intervention is being taken forward in a trial, and I object to use of the term harmful, because it implies knowledge of something being harmful, in which case it will never be approvable by an ethics committee or acceptable on a voluntary basis by a participant who's given information sheet concerning such a trial. I hope I have addressed that point, but if not, I will be available via my email or other social media network in order to address or clarify further.
There's one from Ms. Faiza. What are some obstacles to ethical decision-making for healthcare leaders?
Well, I think, I have not been a member of ethics committee, but I work closely with colleagues who have such a role, including one who's chair of an ethics committee. I think the main obstacle they face is lack of resources to support their work from their organizations. The other obstacle they face is, well, what kind of people need to be members, and how could they cooperate with other ethics committee in order to learn from each other's experiences? So I think there are some obstacles at individual level, but there are other obstacles at organizational level, which leaders of these organizations really need to pay attention to. For example, what is the difficulty in creating the link between ethics approval and prospective registration? There could be a standard directive that ethical approval is subject to prospective registration being made, and the final awarded only when prospective registration has taken place. So these type of barriers, some of them can, through proper organized harmonization of the research process, can facilitate research and convert what is a perceived obstacle into a solution.
We'll take the final question by Mr. Mubashir. Is ethical decision more important than the life of a patient?
So if you think about what is an ethical decision, the ethical decision has at least three principles: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. So when you are saying, is a decision more important than the life of the patient? Well, the patient's autonomy is the most important. If the patient is of conscious mind and is able to make their own decision to accept or reject a care decision, then really the ethical decision would be to follow the choice taken by the patient. In fact, this is a question by Dr. Mubashir. I urge you to seek some text written from within Pakistani medical schools concerning ethics, including research ethics. So this is a topic that is a fundamental topic for health practice. It's not a specific separate topic that only applies to health research. I urge you and all other colleagues to think about this issue of ethics, not just as a question of research ethics, but as a question of daily healthcare practice.
Okay, that's it for the questions. If anyone else has questions or follow-ups, just drop me an email. I'll compile them and then I'll send Professor Khalid those questions for him to answer. With that, we will conclude today's webinar. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Khalid for taking out the time and presenting such a brilliant lecture. Thank you so much, sir. And also thanks to all the participants that are joined in from various countries. We have had a good participation of around 120 participants throughout the webinar. So thank you once again, sir. And hopefully we'll have you in for more webinars. You can also share your presentation with me over the email and I'll send that to all the participants that have attended.
Thank you. I'll definitely do that. And I would like to thank all the participants for attending.
Thank you, sir.